Philip K. Dick is one of the most influential and prolific writers in all of science fiction and has inspired some of the biggest sci-fi adaptations we've seen on screen. But which of his books are my favorite, and what do I think is the best book to start with? Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and I've been on a bit of a PKD kick recently, and I thought now might be a good time to share where I'm at with my PKD journey, because even though I have a bit of a ways to go, I've now read 12 of his books, a nice round even dozen, so I thought I would put them into tier ranks for you. I'm going to be ranking them from S tier through C tier, as I've kind of enjoyed all of the books I've read so far. I don't think any of them deserve a D or an F tier, so I'm going to be ranking them, and at the end of the video, I'm going to be letting you know which is my favorite overall and which of his books I think might be the best one to start with. So let's get into them. We're going to go through them in chronological order, starting with Time Out of Joint. Time Out of Joint follows a character that regularly plays a newspaper competition and always seems to win, and the nature of this competition is a little bit mysterious. Could it be tied to a government conspiracy, or are just some strange things going on inside this main character's head? So for me, reading Time Out of Joint was a little bit like watching an early episode of Seinfeld. There's glimpses of greatness. You can see the style there. It's percolating. You can see the direction that his career would go, but he maybe hadn't quite refined it or mastered it just yet. So I did like some of the surreal elements. It was a little bit uneasy. The atmosphere was good. There's some nice twists here and there. But I think just the thematic payoffs, the plot payoffs, I didn't quite connect with as strongly as I do with some of his later books. And I did find some of the characters just a little bit annoying. But I still enjoyed reading this one. For me, I would put it in the C+ territory. I'm going to put it in the C tier, but it's pretty close to B. I enjoyed this one. Up next, we have The Man in the High Castle. The Man in the High Castle is set in an alternate timeline where the Axis powers were victorious in World War II. And so we join the world a couple of decades later, and we see how things would be different, what the world would look like if things had gone differently in World War II. And I found this to be a very intriguing premise. I was interested to see what kind of world PKD would build and how he would use this world to kind of answer some thematic questions. In the end, I'm not sure that this is actually the main focus of the book. It is the setting of the book, but I think I was a little bit disappointed or maybe just surprised in the direction that the book ended up going. And I think we should always judge a book for what it is as opposed to what we thought it would be. And it's not like I had a misconception of what the book was. I mean, that is the setup for the book, but the threads that PKD decides to pull on, the paths he decides to follow, are maybe just a little bit unexpected from my opinion. So when I was able to kind of then get on board with where the book was going, I liked it. It ended up being less about kind of the state of the world and it being a bit more of a religious, spiritual, internal journey that the book went on. And I like that. I just don't know if the puzzle pieces ever fully fell into place for me. Now, of the books on this list, this is the one that I read the longest ago. So it'd be the one that I'm kind of most interested in rereading, and it'd be the one I'd be most open to having my mind changed on. But for now, this is one that I liked, but I don't think I ever quite got all the way there with it. So I'm going to put this one in B tier. Moving on, we have Martian Time-Slip. Martian Time-Slip is a story about the colonization of Mars and the power struggles that come along with this, as well as interactions with indigenous cultures and themes regarding schizophrenia and autism. I think in a lot of ways this was a forward-looking book, both in terms of the technological and sociological elements. In terms of mental health and things like that, I'm not sure the extent to which these things were really understood in the 60s, and I think Philip K. Dick was looking at these things from a rather interesting angle. It also has a lot of those classic trippy PKD elements, and I think the way the various threads come together in the second half of the book are really satisfying. For me, the only things that held this book back were the first half I felt was a little slow to get going. I felt like there was quite a lot of setup, and I didn't really get invested in the book until things got moving in the second half. And there is also a main character who is rather unlikable, uses some racist language, and while he is depicted as being unlikable and racist, it did make for some uncomfortable reading at times, but overall, I felt like this was a pretty strong book. I'm going to give this a B+. I'm going to put it in B tier, but towards the top of B tier, I think. Next up, The Penultimate Truth. The Penultimate Truth is a dystopian / post-apocalyptic story where, after World War III, Earth is barely livable. We have robots roaming around, and we have many humans living underground. So this book explores power and the manipulation of information. A main mystery in the book is what are really the purposes that humans are serving underground, and what exactly is going on the surface. For me, this book was a little bit hard to get into because even though PKD's books are usually really short and tight, this book I think is under 200 pages, there were just so many characters, and I do like his characters in some of his books, but I felt like in The Penultimate Truth, they didn't really have distinct voices, and so with so many characters that all kind of sounded the same, I started to confuse them, I got a little bit lost, and that's not something I normally feel like I have trouble with while reading, not a trouble that I have with PKD in particular, but I did have it with The Penultimate Truth. Also, some of the reveals that we get later in the book, I felt like we already knew a lot of them or could have easily guessed about 90% of them, so some of the twists and things just didn't hit me, didn't blow my mind the way I know that PKD can with a lot of his other books. So this is definitely a lower tier one for me. I'm going to put The Penultimate Truth in C tier. Up next, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. Three Stigmata takes place in a future where humans have colonized the moon and nearby planets, and many humans are feeling alienated and isolated and lonely, and in order to deal with this, they take a drug called Candy, which induces shared hallucinations with other users of the drug. And a mysterious figure, Palmer Eldritch, returns from his alien adventures with something perhaps even more powerful and even stronger hallucinogenic for the people to try. Now this is why I read PKD, because yes, we do have this kind of trippy world where these characters are going on these hallucinations, but they're not just fun for the sake of it. The way that he weaves these into the narrative and into the themes in a way that has the reader asking questions in the same way that the characters are, I felt to be such a rewarding journey. Not only was it a fun story to follow where it's quite funny at times and the characters are quite interesting, I really resonated with the themes, how it was tackling things to do with loneliness and the different ways in which we try to connect with other people. I think the ending pays off as well. This is one of my favorite PKD books. It's going straight to S tier. Next up, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is set in a post-apocalyptic San Francisco following the events of a nuclear war. And in this society, we have androids, and we follow a character, a bounty hunter, that is recruited to track down some rogue missing androids. So this book was highly influential for a reason. It features some heavy-hitting classic sci-fi tropes, and I would call it proto-cyberpunk. It definitely had an influence on that genre with a kind of noir detective story in a futuristic sci-fi world, and of course it tackles artificial intelligence. Now this is a pretty good detective story, but it also weaves in some interesting things to do with religion, as well as animals. The treatment of animals, the symbol of animals is prominent throughout the story, and I found it a really unique and emotionally resonant way to explore the concepts of empathy. I think this book does a lot of things well, just not sure it quite masters all of them. For me, it's slightly below a couple of my favorite PKD books, but I still loved it. I'm going to put it in A tier. And just quickly, before we get to our next book, if you're interested in seeing what I'll be reading next after my PKD binge, at the end of the video, I'll be spinning the quantum wheel in order to find out the patron pick for the month of March. And for our next book, we have Ubik. Ubik takes place in a world with psychics and anti-psychics, and when an act of corporate espionage goes wrong, we have a member of a security team that ends up in a state of half-life. Ubik feels like one big mind game. It gets off to a little bit of a slow start, but when strange things start to happen, the nature of reality starts to shift. It feels like one big rabbit hole that I just couldn't help but go down. Once things really take off in the second half, I think I finished this book in one sitting, or the remainder of it, because I just needed to know what happens next. PKD masterfully sets up some weird questions for us to try and figure out, and it gives you puzzle pieces, clues, red herrings, and then when you finally get an answer, an even more bizarre question pops up. This is such an engrossing journey that is surprisingly funny at times, and it tackles some really important themes to do with addiction, life, and death. And it just culminates in such a fantastic ending, which will just leave you there thinking, questions spinning through your mind, such as, am I entertained or am I having an existential crisis? For me, this is definitely one of my favorite PKD books. I'm putting it in S tier, and for now, I'm going to put it at the top of S tier. And that brings us to A Maze of Death. A Maze of Death follows a group of colonists and scientists that all arrive on a new planet, but none of them know exactly why they are there, what is their mission as a team, and what exactly waits ahead for them on this strange planet. Pretty quickly, some weird things start to happen on this planet and people start to die. This is one of PKD's darker books. It definitely explores death, as might be suggested by the title, and it uses one of my favorite devices of his where we, the readers, are trying to solve the same mysteries that the characters are. At times I did get frustrated with some of these characters, but I felt like their shortcomings were believable in this high-pressure situation, and I was on board to explore, go on this journey of failure and redemption, and trying to answer these bigger questions to do with life and death. This is another one that I enjoyed a lot. I'm going to put it at the top of A tier. Up next, Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said. Flow My Tears is set in a dystopian future where the government has a stronghold on the population through its use of the police and military. The main character that we follow is a famous TV host, but one day he wakes up and no one seems to recognize him. No one knows who he is. This is a surreal book and another one of PKD's darkest. I think it has some high points, but something that I like in some of his other books is how he's able to balance some of these darker themes, the griminess of the world, with a little bit of empathy, a little bit of hope or positivity, and pretty much everyone in this book is rather unlikable. It's a heavy read, the tone is pretty consistent throughout. There's not a whole lot to root for or be hopeful for in this book, and I think I just wanted a little something to latch onto in order for this to emotionally resonate a little bit more with me. I still like this one overall. I'm going to give it a B+ and put it at the top of B tier. Moving on, we have A Scanner Darkly. This is another book set in a future which is controlled by a surveillance state, and a lot of people in society are addicted to a drug called Substance D. If I were to sum up this book in one word, it would be paranoia. And that's because these characters can't trust anything around them. They're constantly worried about being watched, being listened to, anyone they interact with. They're never sure if they're being lied to. Are they informants? Are they undercover cops? And on top of that, they can't even trust their own senses. They can't trust their own mind because being scrambled by this Substance D. This is a surreal and uncomfortable place to be, but I think the book does a great job of balancing that with some very funny dialogue and moments of empathy. The themes explored in this book, I think, were very personal to PKD, as he explains in an afterword. His life, people around him were affected by some of the things depicted in the book, and I think that emotion really came through in the storytelling. This book had a big impact on me. I'm going to put it at A tier, above A Maze of Death. And for the last two books, I'm actually going to discuss these together, and they are Radio Free Albemuth and Valis. Valis was published in 1981, and Radio Free Albemuth was written in 1976, but not published until later in 1985. And both of these books were inspired by a supernatural event that supposedly happened to PKD himself. So both of these books have a rather interesting feel to them, because in a lot of PKD books, we are kind of exploring crazy things happening to these possibly crazy characters, whereas in this book, we're exploring possibly crazy things happening to a possibly crazy author. And so I think in a way it was him trying to process what happened to him. Was this some sort of mental breakdown, or was this some sort of spiritual or religious experience? I wouldn't say that this is two versions of the same book, as there are quite a lot of differences between them, but there is a little bit of an overlap in terms of some of the plot points, and there is a large overlap in terms of the themes. I read Radio Free Albemuth first, and I found the first half to be really engaging. Then in the second half, as it starts to go down this kind of more abstract path, I'm not sure it quite all came together, and that may have been part of the reason why it wasn't initially published when he first wrote it. Valis, on the other hand, is pretty abstract right from the beginning, and while I wouldn't say it's a necessity to read Radio Free Albemuth first, it might be helpful in terms of giving you a frame of reference for some of the things that are going on. Valis is more of a literary experience than a sci-fi one, and I think PKD changed his approach to writing, as the prose is rather mature but also rather mysterious. Valis is a unique reading experience and one of an ethereal nature. I felt like I was just floating through space and time, exploring this author's mind on a journey through the cosmos to find some kind of meaning or higher power. This is a philosophical book with a lot of poignant things to say. But I think overall, for me, this is a book that I perhaps respect for how ambitious and unique it is, as opposed to something that I fully personally connected with. I'm going to put Radio Free Albemuth at the top of B tier, and I'm going to put Valis at the bottom of A tier. So there you go, those are my current PKD rankings. If I had to pick a favorite so far, I'm going to have to go with Ubik, but it's pretty closely followed by the 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And if I had to pick a book that I think is best to start with for Philip K. Dick, I don't think Ubik would be a bad choice, but for me, I'm going to go with Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. I think it's one that's fairly easy to get into, quite readable, it has a fun story, and has a number of different classic PKD elements to introduce you to his style and maybe encourage you to pick up something next after that one. Let me know in the comments what is your favorite PKD book and what do I need to read next? I still have a bunch to go. Which PKD book belongs on my TBR? I appreciate you guys watching. It's been a couple of weeks since I've been able to make a video, as I did have to move again recently into another short-term rental as I'm still displaced from my home due to the Los Angeles wildfires. And around a week or so ago, I did injure my back. I was at the gym, and I'll throw up a picture of me deadlifting 455, which I've worked my way up to being able to do that for 3 sets of 3 reps. And I'll throw up a second picture of me attempting to do the same with 465. And as you can see, it didn't go so well. Did strain something in my back, did need some help off the floor. So luckily I'm recovering. It shouldn't be too bad in the long run. So I'm happy to be back on YouTube talking to you guys about sci-fi books. And if you were to permit me to talk about one more, let's spin the Quantum Wheel. Welcome to the Quantum Wheel featuring Tiny Jonathan, where all of the patron picks are both simultaneously picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Let's find out what I'll be reading in the month of March. Spin, Quantum Wheel, spin. What are you going to land on? It looks like it could be A Case of Conscience or Born. I think Born's going to hold up. It does. Born by Jeff Vandermeer. So I have read Annihilation. I don't know too much about Born, but considering it's written by Jeff Vandermeer, I'm sure the prose is going to be good and the story's going to be weird. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, A New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakawe, Sumil, and the 3 Stigmata of Karsig Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.